Be seated, thank you. All right, good morning. Anything we need to address before we get started?
Your Honor, just how the court is going to handle the introduction of what we're going to be doing with Dr. Foley.
Okay, yeah, good point. Typically, the instruction given let's see. There's the deposition testimony. It doesn't say deposition, though. Members of the jury, the sworn testimony of Michael Foley given before trial will now be presented. You are to consider and weigh this testimony as you would any other evidence in the case.
Yeah.
Good enough?
And if we could also maybe just introduce the fact that a certain portion of that testimony is going to be with Karina Flores reading a small section of the transcript.
Okay. That's fine. All right. Anything else?
Just that in terms of form, I guess I'm asking, is the court going to say, okay, defense, your next witness, and I can say defense calls Dr. Michael Foley and then instruction?
Yeah.
Okay.
All right, you can bring him in.
I just have one. This is going to be for when we get to Michael Knox, just to supplement our prior argument. I spent some time yesterday going through his testimony, so I just have a little more argument about the admissibility of the mannequin photographs.
Okay, all right. We'll talk about that, I guess, at a break before we do him. How long is this?
It's about an hour 15, something like
Okay.
that. A couple minutes on the
Yeah,
introductory.
CV, okay. And who's going to read what?
Ms. Flores is going to be Dr. Foley.
Okay.
And I'll read the questions that I asked Dr. Foley
Okay,
in terms of the introduction.
Ready for the jurors, Your Honor?
yeah.
Jurors in the courtroom.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back. Were you all able to abide by my instructions during the recess? All right, then we're going to get started. Thank you. All right, Mr. Michaels?
Good morning, Your Honor. Defense calls Dr. Michael Foley.
All right. Members of the jury, the sworn testimony of Dr. Michael Foley given before trial will now be presented via video. You are to consider and weigh this testimony as you would any other evidence in the case. And before we get to his video testimony, Attorney Flores and Attorney Michaels will be reading the portions of his testimony previously given, describing his qualifications. So Ms. Flores will read the part of Dr. Foley, and Mr. Michaels will read his part.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Go ahead.
Ms. Flores.
Yeah, you can come up to the witness stand, please. And the witness was previously sworn in the prior reading. So Ms. Flores will read it just as it is in the transcript.
Thank you, Your Honor. Dr. Foley, what is your present occupation, please?
I'm a diagnostic radiologist and a forensic radiologist.
What's a diagnostic radiologist?
So a diagnostic radiologist is a medical doctor whose job it is to read films of the human body. So whether they're x-rays or CT scans, MRI scans, we read those films and we make a diagnosis of what is going on inside of the patient based on the images.
And what is a diagnostic radiologist?
That one was just diagnostic radiologist.
Forensic?
Forensic radiologist is looking at the images with an eye towards whether the findings are new or old. So in other words, if they're chronic and degenerative or old, or whether they're new and acute.
And have you always been exclusively a forensic radiologist?
No, sir. I've been in practice for 34 years. I've worked at hospitals for 20 years. One of them right in Dade City Hospital, where I was chairman at that hospital for several years. And then I worked at imaging centers for multiple years. And then after those imaging centers were sold, I am now doing forensic radiology.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about your medical educational background. What qualifies you to be both a diagnostic and a clinical radiologist?
Right, so I guess I would start out with internship and so forth. Following college, I went to medical school at Northwestern University in Chicago from 74 to 78 and graduated with an MD degree in 1978. From there, I did a medical internship. And a medical internship, as the court is probably familiar with, is where a physician rotates through the 12 different specialty areas in medicine.
Where did you do your internship at?
I did my internship at the University of California, San Diego. And so it's a 1-year rotation going through the 12 different areas. And it helps most physicians figure out what area of specialty they want to go into. So after doing that, I decided I wanted to go into diagnostic radiology. And I returned to my alma mater, Northwestern University, to do what's called a diagnostic radiology residency. So the residency is one specialty training in diagnostic radiology.
Is there some kind of hierarchy among residents?
Well, of course, the first year, second year, third year, and so forth. But in your last year, the professors in the program pick a chief resident. So one resident to be in charge of all of the other residents. And that person would also have teaching responsibilities to all of the other residents in the program.
And were you ever so honored?
I was honored with that. I was elected by the professor of the program to be chief resident at Northwestern in my senior year.
And are you board certified?
Yes, sir. So following completing the residency at this point, one is considered board eligible. It means you've completed a qualified program. But to become board certified, you have to take the board certification tests. And they consist basically of an 8-hour oral exam where you're tested in the 12 areas of radiology shown. If you pass that test, then you're invited back in about 3 months to take an oral board exam. Again, tested by approximately 12 different experts from throughout the country who show you unknown exams. And if you pass that test, then you are at that point board certified in diagnostic radiology. So I took that test in 1982 following completing my residency, passed both of those on my first attempt, and became board certified in diagnostic radiology in 82.
After becoming board certified, did you do any additional training in radiology?
I did. I stayed on at Northwestern University for an additional year to do what's called a fellowship. And a fellowship is an additional year of focused training. Following completing the fellowship, it qualified me to be able to take an additional board exam, this time in nuclear medicine or nuclear radiology, which has to do with using radioisotopes to image the human body, such as a bone scan, looking for metastatic disease or a kidney scan, liver scan, brain scan. And I took both of those tests, written and oral, passed both of those on my first attempt, and became board certified in nuclear radiology in 1983.
Now that's 2 boards. After that, did you continue your education and training?
Well, at that point, I did go out into practice. But while I was out in practice in 1996, the American Board of Radiology offered for the first time a separate board in interventional radiology. And interventional radiology is the minimally invasive aspect of radiology. So in other words, doing things with needles, guide wire, catheter, and bringing those things into the body and being able to carry out a therapy. So as an example, an angiogram and angioplasty, putting a stent in an artery, whether it's a carotid artery or a kidney artery, running a microcatheter up into the brain to dissolve a clot before the person gets a full-blown stroke, or to coil an aneurysm in the brain so that the person doesn't need to get their skull cut open and their aneurysm clipped. So I had been trained in interventional techniques at Northwestern University, but there was never a separate board for that. So once that became available, I decided to go ahead and take that test, and I passed that on my first attempt as well. So at that point, I had achieved 3 separate boards in radiology: diagnostic radiology, the nuclear radiology, and the interventional radiology.
Is that rare in your field?
It is. Most people stick seek to get board certified, but usually you don't see very many people with 3 separate boards.
Let's talk a little bit about your work history and the positions you've held. I know you spoke about being here in Dade City. Talk to me a little bit about your work history, the different positions you've held.
Okay, so when I left Northwestern after my fellowship in '83, I moved down to Tampa, Florida. I joined a relatively large radiology group in the Tampa area. I think I was the number 15th member in the group. That ultimately, over 20 years, grew to be one of the largest radiology groups in the state of Florida, with 55 men and women radiologists. I was on staff at 7 different hospitals throughout the Bay Area, on staff as a radiologist at Manatee Memorial Hospital in Bradenton, at the Brandon Regional Medical Center, at University Community Hospital, which is now called Florida Hospital University, Community Hospital Carewood, St. Joseph Women's Hospital, Dade City Hospital, and Newport Richey Hospital. Early in my career, I became assistant chairman of radiology at the Manatee Memorial Hospital in Bradenton. Then later, I was elected chairman of radiology at Dade City Hospital, right up here in the Dade City area. Served as chairman of that hospital for multiple years. Then following that, I was elected chairman of radiology at Brandon Regional Medical Center, where I served for about 10 years as chairman and also sat on the executive committee at that hospital for about 10 years.
Now, have you served on any committees or had any leadership roles in various medical organizations?
I have. I've sat on some national committees. One of them is called the Society of Interventional Radiology, and I was on that committee for several years. I have worked locally, I'm on the editorial board of Hillsborough County Medical Association Journal. I've also served as president of the Florida West Coast Radiology Society, which is a membership of radiologists up and down the west coast of Florida, wrapping around from the Panhandle all the way up to Miami. And this is an organization where we use the dues that we collect from radiologists to fly in experts from around the country to give us a lecture. And then we can sit with them after the lecture and compare how they're doing things at the Mayo Clinic or Mass General or UC San Francisco compared to what we're doing at our hospitals in the Tampa Bay area.
What's the American College of Radiology?
So the American College of Radiology is an organization that oversees all radiologists throughout the United States. And most radiologists do belong to the American College of Radiology.
Now, I understand that you are a fellow of the American College of Radiology. Is that true?
That is true.
What is that?
So a fellow is one of the highest levels that you can achieve in the American College of Radiology. Basically, one will need to be nominated and elected as a fellow, and it's based on your contributions to radiology, leadership roles in radiology, or publications and teaching in radiology. So I was very honored to be elected to that position. It allows one, besides writing your name, Michael J. Foley, MD, you get to put FACR at the end of your name as well, which stands for Fellow of the American College of Radiology. And even though most people don't know what that means, people in medicine do know what that means.
Now, have you published any articles or participated in presenting any scientific courses or seminars in your specialty?
I have. I think I've got 34 publications right now, and many of the publications have to do with trauma radiology. And some of the first articles that I wrote, in fact, were due to spine trauma and brain trauma. Another area of interest of mine has been MI or breast cancer, and I've written a few articles on that as well.
Now, you've talked about being a member of a big imaging center. Whatever happened to that particular imaging center?
Well, I think I took you through the hospital years. So I worked at those 7 hospitals that I mentioned for about 20 years, and so that would take me from '83 to 2003. So in 2003, I left hospital radiology and helped open a couple of imaging centers in the Tampa Bay area. One of them is right up here on I-75 and Highway 54. So those are full-service imaging centers that do everything from X-ray, CT, MRI, nuclear medicine, studies, and so forth. And ultimately, after working at those centers for multiple years, Tampa General Hospital came to me and basically they wanted to buy both of those imaging centers. And so I, along with one of the other radiologists there, decided to go ahead and sell those centers. So at that point, I could have retired from radiology. But all along during my career, ever since 1987, I've also served as a forensic radiology expert. And I still continue to have a string of expert cases coming into me. So rather than fully retiring, I decided to continue with the expert radiology until such time that I do decide to retire. So with that in mind, that's why I'm here today. I looked at some imaging studies that you sent to me, and then part of that is if you're needed to come to court and explain those findings to the judge or the jury, that you would be willing to do so.
Okay, at this time I would move into evidence as 5 and 6, 5 being the MRI, and then the video starts. Mr. Funderburk, can you help me, please? Turn it on. May Ms. Flores step down while this is playing, Your Honor, please? Wait for the judge. Okay, Mr. Vandenberg.
Mr. Reeves taken June 2015, Exhibit 6, being the X-ray taken of Curtis Reeves, June 2015, both stimulated to body state. Dr. Foley, you had an opportunity to actually download the information that we provided you into your own computer, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And is that what we have here on this table to my left?
Yes, sir, it is.
If you would, please, with the court's permission, Dr. Foley, would you come down and let's take a look at what we have here.
Okay, very good.
If Dr. Foley is going to testify, share his back as court to the state, is there any way that we can hook up a microphone or something so that we can hear him, because he's really talking down into his computer away from us?
Just move that mic, I guess, down a little bit.
Okay, Dr. Foley, you had an opportunity to look at both X-ray images and MRI, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And what's the difference between an X-ray and MRI?
So an X-ray basically is one of the oldest imaging studies around. X-rays have been known for over 100 years. An X-ray basically is a form of invisible light, and it was discovered that if one focuses an X-ray and shoots it through a body part, say with film underneath, it can record images of the human body. So basically, an X-ray shows us bones very well, allows us to see if there is a fracture or a dislocation, allows us to see if there are arthritic changes of the bones, and it's a common imaging study even today. X-ray does not show certain things, though, like you cannot see the spinal cord on a spine study. You do not see the disc. You do not see the spinal cord or the nerve roots. So if we want to see those type of findings, we need to go to a higher imaging study, which would be an MRI, which stands for magnetic resonance imaging, sometimes referred to as MR, magnetic resonance. And it basically is not an X-ray study. It doesn't use ionizing radiation. It takes advantage of the fact that our body is composed of about 75% water, H2O, and it was discovered that the hydrogen atoms in water, when put into a magnetic field, give off a magnetic resonance, a signal that can be picked up by the MRI scanner, and it can locate each and every one of those signals of the hydrogen atoms in three-dimensional space and locate them in an X, Y, and Z plane. And so from all of this information, very accurate images can be constructed of the human body. So for the first time, we can accurately see the discs, the spinal cord, the nerve roots, brain tissue, all sorts of things that we couldn't see before on regular X-rays. So as you said, in this particular series of studies, we have X-rays and MRIs to look at.
Okay, and you've arranged them in kind of a logical order, is that fair to say?
Yes, sir.
Well, where are we going to start?
Well, we start right up at the top. I've got them labeled 1 through 11, and so we can look at, first of all, the hands.
Let me ask you something before you get there. If you could pull back a little bit, please. What is this writing we see on the image, up on the left and the right-hand side?
Yes. So, let me focus in on this. So this is just all the verification that the pictures we're looking at are of the particular patient we're talking about. So in this case, it says the imaging center Rose Radiology where the study was carried out. It says the patient's name, Curtis Reeves. It gives the date of birth, 8/31/42. States the patient is 72 years old. And then over here, this is telling us the date of the study. So this study was performed on 6/8/15, so June 8, 2015. So most of the images that we're going to look at were done on either June 8, 2015, or the MRI studies that we'll look at were done on June 9, 2015.
So what are we looking at here, Doctor?
So these are views of the hands, the right hand and the left hand. And what we can see is arthritic changes of both hands. But I'll focus in on some of the findings so the jury and the judge can appreciate this. This is the thumb right here we're looking at. And all of these are bones of the wrist called the carpal bones. If we focus into this area right here, we're looking at what is called the radiocarpal joint space, and this is the first metacarpal bone. One of the things to notice is how close the bone is to one another. So in other words, if we use this as an example here, notice that we see a space between this bone and this bone. That's because cartilage, which cannot be seen on an x-ray, separates the two pieces of bone. When the cartilage is worn down or worn out, we get this bone-on-bone appearance that we see here. So this would be an example of degenerative change of the first carpal metacarpal joint, where we literally have bone-on-bone. Also realize that bone reacts by, when it develops degenerative change, by trying to thicken up the bone, and the thickening of the bone causes the bone to appear denser on the x-ray, and dense bone will look white. So if we look down here at the radius, so we're right at the wrist, this is the radius, this is the ulna, notice that the bone is very white here. That is sclerotic bone or thickening of bone. Notice the bone right here and right here is very white. So that is more sclerotic bone. Even note where we have the wearing out of cartilage right here, we also have this white line of sclerosis, which is a sign of degenerative change. As we look at the other bones throughout the body, or throughout the hand here, and this is the right hand, we can see narrowing of the interphalangeal joints. So the interphalangeal joints are the various joints of the fingers, and that narrowing is degenerative change there as well. White sclerosis is degenerative change. So this patient has degenerative change, particularly at the so-called DIP, distal interphalangeal joints, which are the distal most aspect of the joint spaces of the hand. So, and the left hand has similar findings. If we go over here to the left hand, notice we have narrowing of the various joints of the wrist, narrowing and degenerative change of the first carpal metacarpal joint, and then as we go to the interphalangeal joints, we see arthritic changes with sclerosis and narrowing of those joints. So basically both hand films show degenerative changes, both left-sided and right-sided, involving the carpal bones and also involving the interphalangeal joints.
And so when you say degenerative changes, what are you talking about?
So degenerative change is sort of a broad umbrella term to refer to wearing out of the joint space. So we know as we age, we have been moving our body parts for years and years, and that can lead to those joint spaces and those various body parts to wear out. and that wearing out process is called degenerative change. So, an analogy compared to like a tire of a car, if you just put a new set of tires on your car and drove the car for 10 miles and then checked the tread on the tire, it would be fine. Nothing much would be happening after 10 miles. But if you check those tires after 40,000 miles, the tread would be worn down to some degree. So that would be degenerative change in a way, or wearing out of the tire. Same kind of process is going on inside the human body, where we're slowly wearing out our various body parts over time.
Now, would you agree or disagree with me that those changes happen over a period of time and not overnight or maybe within the years?
Well, that's true. I mean, degenerative change in general takes years and years, so it's not something that pops up in 6 months or a year or something like that. It takes many, many years to get the kind of findings that we're seeing here.
Now, an individual with a similar x-ray, would it be consistent with somebody who, let's say, had trouble opening a jar?
Yes, well, particularly since we noticed that the degenerative change of the joints of the thumb are prominent in this patient. As we can see here, we see another nice demonstration of sclerosis of the bone. So typically a patient with this kind of degenerative change in this location will have a weakness of hand grip, for instance. And one of the things that people tend to notice when they have that is that the jar, they can't open a jar. You have a jar of pickles or mustard, can't get it open because the whole grip of the hand is not as strong as what it used to be.
And you talked about distal phalange, you talked about the fingertips?
So basically, right at joint, right before you get to the nail of the finger, this is where we're seeing degenerative change as well. Yeah. So we're even seeing like this little osteophyte that's showing up right here.
What's an osteophyte?
So an osteophyte is basically a bony growth. Osteo means bone, and phyte means growth. So the bone, by constant rubbing bone on bone, develops thickening of the bone that eventually turns into these bony osteophytes that we see.
Now the x-rays we're looking at concerning the fingertips, I know not your term, the fingertips, would that be consistent with somebody who now has trouble maybe doing detail work with their hands, such as stitching, for instance?
Yes, when you have degenerative change in the fingers, we often notice we are not able to move our fingers as well, so sometimes that is reflected in their handwriting, and as you said, in any kind of detailed work that one might do.
Okay. We look at, I apologize, Doctor, can we just look at the image number just so we can put it on the record, please?
So that image number that I had was number 1, which was of the bilateral hands. That was done on 6/8/15. And so now we can move to the wrists, take a quick look at that. So again, the wrists are this area of the hand, so that all of these carpal bones down here are part of the wrist. This is the radius right here, and this is the ulna. And again, basically it's showing us the same thing that we already saw in the hands, just a more focused on view. And it particularly nicely demonstrates the bone-on-bone appearance of the degenerative change of the first carpal metacarpal joint. So we're literally seeing bone-on-bone here with the dense white sclerosis of the bone, particularly involving the region of the thumb of both hands. And the next one we'll go to is the left shoulder. And the left shoulder is where obviously the humerus, the long bone in our upper arm, connects to or articulates with the scapula, which commonly, layman's term might be considered like the wing bone, but in medical terms, this complex appearing bone, as outlined here, is part of the scapula. And the scapula has a curved cup-like shape called the glenoid, and the humeral head articulates and connects into this glenoid area. This part that we're seeing here is the collarbone, and over here is the acromion, and this area right here. And if we look over here, this is called the AC joint or acromioclavicular joint. And what we're noticing is that the patient has osteophytic changes in this region as well. So this pointed piece of bone here and the pointed piece of bone here is arthritic change of the AC joint. If we move over here, we can again see some more osteophyte here and here. So the important point of seeing the degenerative change of the AC joint is to realize that the rotator cuff, the muscles, and then the tendons come through this region right here and connect to this area of bone called the greater tuberosity. So in this region is sometimes referred to as a critical zone. And so as someone attempts to lift their arm up, this muscle and tendon system works as a pulley to lift the humerus up from this edge, but the tendon tends to get scraped across these osteophytic changes that are right here, which can cause pain in any individual patient and can scrape the tendon to the point that the patient can eventually develop what is called a rotator cuff tear, where the tendon is actually frayed and kind of sawed through that area so that the tendon eventually becomes completely torn.
And what we're looking at, again, the same sort of question in terms of time period. Is this something that's degenerative in nature, happens over a period of time, and not something that is the result of an acute injury, for instance?
That's true. Again, all these degenerative changes that we're pointing out typically take years to form. This is not something that you get in a relatively short period of time. So this is the left shoulder. If we move over here, that was number 3 on this list, so number 4 will be the right shoulder. If we look at this, not surprisingly, we see the same kind of findings. So here is the acromioclavicular joint. This is the clavicle right here, and this is the acromion process of the scapula. The space in between is the so-called AC joint or acromioclavicular joint. Perhaps the judge has heard of AC joint separation. Sometimes football players get this kind of thing where the AC joint is separated. But notice again here, just like on the left shoulder, we're now looking at the right shoulder, we see this bony osteophyte right here. And the critical nature of something like that is, again, the tendon of the rotator cuff passes through here and attaches over here. So with this piece of bone now in the way, it serves as a mechanism where it can scrape away and saw away, if you will, at the tendons of the rotator cuff and can cause pain, can cause rotator cuff tear, for instance, in any individual patient.
Is an individual who has an x-ray like this, is it consistent with somebody who has difficulty raising their arm?
Well, it is, because realize again, the rotator cuff muscles and then the tendon come through this area and attach over here. I think we see it better on this, where it's the greater tuberosity. So if the muscle has to pull the tendon through this area, this tends to be painful. This often causes limitation in movement of the shoulders. It often causes the person not to use their shoulder so much because of the fact that it hurts when you do it. And so consequently, the muscles of the rotator cuff begin to lose mass and become what is called atrophy or shrink. So the muscles become smaller in size and become weaker. So it is not unusual when we see patients like this that they have limitation in range of motion, they have shoulder pain, the muscles in this region are often atrophied and have gotten weaker over time.
And in older patients, would you expect some atrophy whether or not we had such an acute, is that also called a bone spur?
Yes, sir. Bone spur is a typical layman's term, for instance, for an osteophyte, which is the medical term, which simply means osteobone phyte, meaning growth.
So my question was then, even if we didn't have that bone spur, would we expect in an elderly patient to see a diminished muscle mass?
Well, I think that's true in almost everybody. As we get older, we do lose muscle mass over time, even despite the fact that we try to go to the gym and work out and everything. It might help maintain some of the muscle mass, but we invariably do get weaker over time. We invariably lose muscle mass over time, despite our best attempts for most of us.
And might an individual whose x-ray looked like this have difficulty in picking up heavy items?
Well, that's true. I mean, anytime you have to use the shoulder, you're going to be affecting this area, and it could be difficult in any particular patient to lift heavy items up, to move the shoulder in general because of the limitations by the AC joint arthritis.
And is there anything else that we're seeing that is of interest, Doctor?
I think those are the main findings on that, the type of degenerative changes that can occur. And so here, just to go through the anatomy a little bit, this is called the femoral head right here. This is called the greater trochanter. This is where tendons attach from the muscles in our thigh. Right here is the hip joint. And notice that we again have this finding of this dense sclerosis along the 11 o'clock, 12 o'clock, 1 o'clock region of the acetabulum. And again, the acetabulum is the cup-like shape of where the femoral head fits into the pelvis. So, and it makes sense that we would see something like that in this region because as a person is standing, they're putting a lot of pressure on the upper aspect of the acetabulum, and so the bone tries to add additional bone density, which creates a sclerosis, but is also a form of degenerative change. Also notice if one evaluates the vertical height between the femoral head here to there versus the vertical height of the femoral head from here to here, notice that it's narrower here, and that again is a sign of degenerative change of the hip. Same kind of other finding though, remember we talked about the osteoporosis, how we have some dense bone here, but loosened bone over here, loosened bone over here, loosened bone over here. This is all evidence of osteopenia, osteoporosis of the bone.
Anything else remarkable about the hip we're looking at, Doctor?
I think that's about it for the time being. We can go now to the left knee. And this again, we're still on 6/8/15.
I forgot to ask you, I apologize. The x-ray of the hip and the degenerative properties that you described, is that something that we would expect to happen over time, as in the other x-rays?
Yes. Again, typically degenerative change takes years and years to develop. So this is not something that just pops up in a year or two. It generally takes many, many years. Having gray hair, I kind of related to a person, how long does it take to get gray hair? Many times you're not going to be able to say, my hair went totally gray in a year or two. It generally occurs over a long period of time. So maybe in your late 20s or 30, you have a few speckles of gray hair, and then your 30s and 40s, you got more gray hair, and now it's going from gray to white, such that by the time you get into your 60s, you have all white hair. So you could look at somebody like that and feel fairly assured that they didn't go from brown or black hair to gray hair in a matter of a year or two. It typically would take many, many years, whether it's 5 years or 10 years or 20 years, who knows for sure in that individual, but it would take more than just a year or two. And so the same kind of thing with degenerative change inside the body. It doesn't happen in 1 or 2 years. It takes many, many years to get that.
On to the knee.
So we'll go to the left knee now, and this is 6/8/15. So I'll show the judge this one first. This is so-called standing views of the knees, with the person standing up and the x-ray plate behind their knees, and the x-ray is shot straight through. So this is the left knee over here. This is the right knee over here, just to go over some anatomy. This is the femur, which is the long bone of our thigh, coming down to form part of the knee joint. This round piece of bone is the kneecap, or medically called a patella, right here and right over here. The two bones that are seen that go from the knee joint downward, the larger bone is called the tibia. Commonly people call this the shin bone. Sometimes we accidentally run our tibia into the coffee table or something like that, and this is that major, larger bone. The smaller bone out to the side of our calf, both left side and right side, on the outer side is the fibula. And so these are the two bones of the lower knee joint. So the knee joint is actually this part right here, where the femur bone comes together with the joint space, and then the tibia here and the fibula here. And what we're seeing basically in this is that we're seeing the medial knee joint, medial meaning the inside of the knee joint is narrow. It should be wider than this. And if we compare to the lateral knee joint, it should have a nice vertical height like this, but right here it's narrow both on the right side and on the left side. In addition, we see sclerosis, this white thickening of bone along the tibial plateau. This whole area is called the tibial plateau here. And we've already learned that the buildup or thickening of bone is called sclerosis, a sign of degenerative change, and losing the vertical height of the joint is also a sign of degenerative change. And so the patient has a pattern that's typical for developing degenerative change in the knee, and that is it's affecting the medial side of the knee joint. And the court may not know that in most people, it's the medial side of the knee joint that wears out first in almost all people, and that's because just the angle of the way the femur comes down, when we stand, we put most of our weight on the medial aspect of the knees, and thus we tend to wear out the medial aspect of our knees faster than the outer or lateral aspect. And so it's quite common not only to get the degenerative bony changes like we see here, but also to get tears of the meniscus, the cartilage that fits in between these two bones. So the court may have heard of medial meniscal tears being discussed in other patients, other cases, and this is the reason why, is this is the area that gets the biggest workout. If we look at the side view or lateral view, and again we're looking at left knee here, notice that we see this patella from the side, the kneecap, and notice that we see the patella lying very close to the femur, the femoral condyle, almost bone on bone. Now realize the bone of the femur is capped by cartilage, and the back of the patella is capped by cartilage. So when one has degenerative change, the cartilage wears out, and this bone-on-bone appearance begins to occur. And notice, if you want to see an osteophyte here, this pointed piece of bone right here is an osteophyte, bony overgrowth. So when this person is moving or walking, this patella would be rubbing bone on bone in this region, and this osteophyte would be scraping on the cartilage and on bone. A kind of finding that we all can get when we get in our 70s, just from the use of our legs and our knees over time. So that was the left knee. If we go to number 8, which is the right knee, again, we already went over this front picture, the standing view, where we see the medial right knee joint narrowed. But let's look at the side view for a second. And again, in this view, notice that the patella is high riding. That means we'd like to see this patella down more along this region. In other words, the top of this patella should be sitting down here more. And it's not, so one might question whether the person has had some previous injury to the tendons attaching to the patella. That would be the quadriceps tendon up here attaching to the patella, and the patellar tendon down here. Nevertheless, we can see this bone-on-bone appearance, just like we saw in the left knee, on the right side, a sign of degenerative change of the meniscus. So basically, we have degenerative change of both knees, involving the medial knee joint and involving both what are called the patellofemoral joint, meaning the patella and the femur are narrowed in that area, thus called the patellofemoral joint.
Would you agree with me that we can't see pain on an x-ray?
That's correct. We can see the anatomy on x-rays and MRIs. We cannot tell what severity of pain the patient may be in at the time, just based on the x-ray or the MRI.
But based on what we're looking at, would it be inconsistent with an individual that complains of knee pain, for instance?
No, not at all. I mean, it's quite common when people have degenerative change in their knees like this that they would have pain.
And you're calling them degenerative changes, so we're talking about these changes happen over a period of time?
Yes, sir, typically many years. We then go, so at this point we're going to go from the 6, 8 studies. We've covered all the regular x-ray studies, and now number 9, 10, and 11, we'd be covering the MRI cervical, MRI thoracic, MRI lumbar, done the next day on 6, 9, 15. Should we keep going and go to the cervical now?
Let's do that.
Okay.
And before we go to the cervical, I noticed there looks like 6 images. How does a radiologist actually look at MRIs? Do they do it just in still images?
Okay, well, I'll show you. And just as an example, I'm popping up this still image, and we'll go more thorough to explain it about what this side view or sagittal view is and what this axial view. But if you'd like, I can just bring up the whole study so that the court can see how one would analyze a study. Is that okay? So if we open up this study, basically you can see all the different images that were performed on this exam. We can see that 9 survey images were done, then 15 sagittal images, so-called T2 weighted, which makes the spinal fluid white, 13 sagittal or side view, so-called STIR or stir images, which allows us to see fluid signal particularly well, 13 T1 weighted images where the spinal fluid is back, and then 28 axial images. So to show the court how one might evaluate this, if we press on the sagittal images, and make this larger so we can see it. Notice when we first start looking at the side view, and just for orientation, this would be the person's chin here, and this would be the back of the neck over here. We're not really seeing any cervical spine yet, and that's because this initial image is taken off to the side, and then as we move forward, we're beginning to now cut into the cervical spine. Now we're into the mid-cervical spine, where we can see spinal cord, and as we cut through, we're cutting out of the cervical spine, getting to the opposite side of the neck. So just toggling through this, there's certain things that we can see. What we're noticing here, and if I zoom this up a little bit, this tall vertebral body in the cervical spine is called C2 or cervical 2. And then from there, once we identify that, we can count down to C3, cervical 4, cervical 5, C6, C7. One of the first things that we can notice is if we look at the back of the disc, we can see some discs are flat, like this disc at C2-3, and some discs are sticking out, like we see at the C5-6, C6-7 levels. So let's go now and look at an axial view. An axial is a cross-sectional view, and so if we look at that, we're now seeing, I'm going to bring this down a little bit. We're now seeing both the axial view and the sagittal view. The sagittal is the side view, the axial is the cross-sectional view. And if the court notices there's a line coming through the spine right here, and as I rotate this line moves. So this line is telling us what level we're cutting through which disc. So if we bring this line down to where the disc is the biggest, right here, and let's bring that over here, and let's adjust it a little bit like that. So what we can see here is that the disc is sticking out, coming very close to the cord, and the disc is sticking out here. Now I have a magnified picture of that so we can see it even better, which would be this view that the court can take a look at. And in this view, we can see that the disc is extending out and herniating out into the spinal canal. Now just for orientation, this is the cervical spinal cord, this structure running up and down. The white is spinal fluid wrapping around the cervical spinal cord, and the disc sticking out shouldn't be like that. It should be flat like the disc above. If we want to talk about this disc, we call out the vertebral body above and below. So if I want to talk about this disc, I would say at the C5-6 level, meaning the disc between C5 and C6, there is a disc sticking out, and it's approaching the front surface of the spinal cord there. If we want to look at that in the axial view, we come over here, and in this cross-sectional view, all of this is herniated disc material sticking out into the spinal canal and lying up adjacent to the cord. Realize this entire area here should be white. It should be white spinal fluid. Here's the spinal cord right here, so this disc is sticking out and coming very close to the cervical spinal cord. If we go to the next level down and analyze this from the side view, the sagittal view, notice the disc is sticking out here. It's extending upward and extending downward. So this means that the disc has literally herniated out of the wall of the disc with jelly material extending upward and downward. So that is called a disc extrusion. And if one looks at the front margin of the cord, notice how the cord has like an indent here. That means, and that tells us that as this person flexes their neck forward, the cord bends over these regions, and the herniated disc has literally caused an indent into the cord in this region. If we look at it from the axial view perspective, notice how close the herniated disc is to the front of the cervical spinal cord. There's virtually no white spinal fluid here separating the back of the disc to the front of the spinal cord. And so those are the two most important features on this study. However, there's a lot of degenerative findings. For instance, the court may not know that the disc should have a white-looking center like we see here, but notice all these discs are black, 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 black. All of the discs that are black like this mean that they've lost the water content in the disc. So all of these discs should have a grayish-white center to them. That loss of water content is a sign of degenerative change of the disc, where fluid has leaked out of the disc over time. And
why is that important, Doctor?
Well, it's just a sign that this person has multi-level degenerative disc disease changes up and down the cervical spine, really sparing the C4-5 disc, but all the rest of the discs are all degenerated. If we want to see a nice example of an osteophyte, here is a bone spur sticking out here, bone spur sticking out at this level, bone spur over here at C6-7 sticking out, and in the back we have these herniated discs sticking into the spinal canal. So these findings are very significant because in general it is thought that the cord does not like being touched by anything except spinal fluid. So when you have these findings sticking out into the spinal canal, touching the spinal cord and lying near the spinal cord, this can cause symptomatology for a patient. This can cause weakness of the upper extremities for a patient.
And when you say symptomatology, what do you mean?
Well, symptomatology meaning pain, tingling, numbness, things of that nature. That would be the kind of symptoms one can get.
Okay, what do we have next?
Okay, so we're going from the cervical spine, which was number 9, MRI cervical spine. We'll go to the thoracic spine. So the thoracic spine, as the court probably knows, the neck is called the cervical spine. We've got 7 cervical vertebral bodies. The mid-back is the thoracic spine. There are 12 thoracic vertebral bodies. These are where our ribs are attached to our thoracic vertebral bodies. So we know we have 12 ribs on each side, and we also have 12 thoracic vertebral bodies where the ribs can attach. The key finding here, so there's lots of disc levels in the thoracic spine because there's one disc between each of the 12 thoracic vertebral bodies. But notice at first glance, all of the discs in the thoracic spine are black. They're darkened. That's called disc desiccation. So every one of these discs are degenerated up and down the thoracic spine. Notice that we have prominent osteophytes at some levels in the thoracic spine. But here's probably one of the more important findings is we have a disc sticking out in the mid-thoracic spine right here at T7-8, and it is immediately abutting the thoracic spinal cord. We can see it right here, and if we go over to this view, we can see it right here. So this disc is sticking out and immediately abutting the thoracic spinal cord. Again, the importance of that is just like in the cervical spine, this can cause symptomatology such as pain, weakness, tingling, numbness. It can also be a source of overall weakness to the person's back because of pressing on the spinal cord at that level.
Now we're looking at a still picture, a static image. Is that how it works in the body? The spinal cord just stays in one place?
Right, well, that's an interesting question. Just like in the cervical spine or thoracic spine, obviously we need still images to get clear pictures of the spine and vertebral bodies and the cord, spinal cord. But in real life, obviously, the neck flexes back and forth, the thoracic spine flexes and extends back and forth. So what happens is that this spinal cord actually moves and slides up and down within the spinal canal. And so the spinal cord itself can get scraped and roughened up by these discs that stick out. And we saw those two significant discs in the cervical spine and this one disc in the thoracic spine. So the point I think you're raising is that the spine actually moves, and so the spinal cord itself inside is going to be moving and scraping up and down against these discs and spur formation that sticks out. And that in and of itself can cause problems to the thoracic spinal cord and cervical spinal cord, leading to effects on the nerves that are contained in the spinal cord. So that's the thoracic spine, and then lastly, we have the lumbar spine, number 11. And this was fairly remarkable because of this finding. So here's the lumbar spine. So we've covered cervical, where we have 7 cervical vertebral bodies. We've covered the thoracic spine, the mid-back, where we have 12 thoracic vertebral bodies. Now we're into the lower back. And for orientation purposes, these are the vertebral bodies. This is the lowest one in the lumbar area. This is called L5, then L4, L3, L2, L1, and then this is thoracic 12 here. So what I put an arrow on is this finding right here. There is a cystic appearing fluid collection in the lowermost tip of the spinal cord. So if we back up a section, probably most folks that aren't medical people do not know that the spinal cord itself ends typically at about the T12 or L1 level. It doesn't run all the way down to the lower part of the spinal canal. So if we look in this patient, here's L5, L4, L3, L2, L1. It's ending in the typical location of many patients, where it's ending at around the L1 level. Some can end as low as T12, others go down to L1. But what we have is we have a fluid collection in the spinal cord. This is not normal, it's not typical. This is called a syrinx, and a syrinx is an abnormal fluid collection within the spinal cord itself. This can cause weakness because it affects the nerves running down the spinal cord, and we see this nicely demonstrated on the lumbar view at the T12 L1 level, and this is the corresponding axial view. And if you look at this for a second, here is the spinal cord, and this round hole, essentially, that we see in the spinal cord is the syrinx. So there literally is a cystic cavity in the spinal cord itself, which in general can cause weakness for a patient, sometimes incoordination of the legs, may even cause imbalance for a patient. Also, look at the disc. We've learned to look for disc desiccation now. Look at the disc here. It's black, 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 black. These lower two have a small amount of remaining fluid collection in the disc, so this is some residual hydration in the disc. But we have multi-level degenerative discs. These discs are not, even these down here, are not as white as what they should be. They should be comparable to the white spinal fluid, and they're not. So all of the discs have become desiccated to some degree. If we look at one last finding here, we're seeing what is called an annular tear, and the court has probably heard about annular appears before where the outer wall of the disc called the annulus is torn, and this can be a source of degenerative change and may cause symptoms for some patients. So really, we took sort of a whirlwind tour up and down the cervical, thoracic, and lumbar spine and saw two large herniated discs in the cervical spine. We saw a disc sticking out and touching the cord in the thoracic spine. In the lumbar spine, we saw a cystic cavity in the lower spinal cord called the syrinx. We see multi-level degenerative changes up and down the lumbar spine, and finally we see this annular tear in the lower lumbar spine.
This syrinx, is this a common occurrence?
No, it's actually rather rare. They can be produced by trauma, and they can be congenital, but if you lined up 100 people, you wouldn't hardly see it in one or two people of that entire 100-person population, so it's not a very common finding.
From the appearance of the syrinx, is this something that would take time to develop?
Well, it would, even if it's trauma related, it takes time to develop, but something like this likely has been around for many, many years.
Thank you. I don't have any other questions.
Okay, thank you.
Want to take your seat, please?
Yes.
One last question.
All right.
Now, the opinions you've expressed today, are they all within a reasonable degree of medical certainty?
Yes, sir, they are.
I don't have any further questions.
Thank you.
Pause.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Judge. Afternoon, Dr. Foley.
Good afternoon, sir.
We'll go back a few minutes to the beginning of your testimony. You didn't hire by the defense in this case?
Yes.
Did you sign an employee contract with them?
No.
All right. And your hourly rate to be paid in return for your services?
It's $750 an hour.
And up to today, how many hours have you put into this case at $750 an hour?
Well, the total bills, I think we talked about before, adds up to $5,000. $2,900 of that was review of the films, which are just flat fee charges. And then I had 2 one-hour conferences and spent about 30 minutes loading the films on the computer and selecting out the images.
And then you have your time here today?
Yes, sir.
All right, which you haven't billed for yet?
Good night.
All right. Before we get into the individual x-rays and MRIs, you would agree that not everyone has the same pain threshold. That's a fair statement, isn't it?
True.
Prior to coming in the courtroom today, did you have an occasion to sit down with Mr. Reeves and conduct a medical history?
No, I want to make that very clear to the court and the judge that as a radiologist, I read the films of people, so normally I'm not sitting down, meeting the patient, talking to the patient, examining the patient. Basically, my exam of the patient, as most radiologists, is looking at the film. So we're not sitting there tapping on knees or taking a history. We're reading the films of the patient.
In this particular case, what was the years of the last films that you looked at prior to June of 2015 as far as x-rays of Mr. Reeves' hips, knees, shoulders, and fingers?
Those were all June 8th and June 9th, 2015.
Prior to that, what was the date and the years of the x-rays that you used to compare with the x-rays of June 2015?
These were the only films that I had, so I read what I was given.
You have no way to go back, say, on January 13th, 2014, and tell this court whether or not what we saw here and displayed today was the same, substantially same, or even different than what was taken on June 8th, 2015.
Well, I think that's true to a degree. We know the findings are long-standing, that it takes many, many years to get those findings, but if no one takes an x-ray on a certain day, you can't with 100% certainty say what the film looks like on that particular day.
So what we were presented here today is simply a snapshot in the light of the medical history of Mr. Reeves on June 8th and June 9th of 2015.
That's true.
You cannot, to any reasonable degree of medical certainty, go back and tell this court that at the time of this particular incident on January 13th, 2014, that Mr. Reeves' condition was exactly the same as it was presented by the x-rays today. You can't do that to any degree of medical certainty.
No, I would not try to do that because I'd want to have a film done exactly that day. But I'm not trying to say that the films looked exactly the same either. I'm saying those films show degenerative changes that likely took a long time, many, many years. So more likely than not, I could say that these kind of findings pre-existed the date of the incident.
But you cannot say to what extent they existed.
I agree with that.
Right. And along those same lines, if we go back to January 13, 2014, it is just as consistent that the degree of the degenerative, what was the word after that?
Degenerative changes?
Yeah, the degenerative changes that you said have taken place over the years. You don't know to what extent on January 13, 2014, Mr. Reeves was aware of those due to any type of outward manifestations of pain.
Right, as I mentioned to the judge, I'm not trying to testify about what symptoms this patient specifically would have, because in order to find out symptoms, one would have to talk to the patient, interview the patient, and so forth. What my testimony was, based on the degree of degenerative changes, it's common for patients to have pain, but as you say, you could have two people that have the same degree of degenerative change, and one might say they have pain 3 out of 10, and the other person might say they have pain 8 out of 10. So there could be some variability among patients. I'm just saying that more likely than not, these findings pre-existed the date of the incident.
And along those same lines, on January 13, 2014, you cannot tell the judge as an expert to any reasonable degree of medical certainty exactly what Mr. Reeves knew about his physical condition, correct?
Right, I would have no idea. You would have to interview the patient to know that.
And you did not know that?
No, my job is to read what I see on the films.
Which were taken in June of 2015.
Yes, sir, that's true.
Okay. What I'd like to do is just very generally go through the different areas. All right. Maybe I'm going to think about that in a second.
Okay.
We have call on the council, Judge.
Evening.
Thank you. Thank you, Judge. No further questions?
Thank you. Any readers?
I apologize, Doctor, I forgot to ask you, is there another area of concern regarding the coaxial nerve? Mr. Reeves' MRI, you aware?
Not quite sure what you mean by coaxial nerve.
Well, there's an opening where some nerves pass through,
Yes.
and
Are you referring to maybe spinal canal stenosis? Is that what you're talking about? Okay, yes, sir.
and did you identify any spinal canal stenosis in Mr. Reeves' images?
Yes, sir. Several areas, and the court might remember this, where we see the large herniated discs at C5-6 and C6-7. When the disc is sticking out into the spinal canal, the cord is actually being pushed back in the spinal canal, and so that tightness that is wrapping around the spinal canal, because the disc is pushing into it, is narrowing the space that the spinal cord can come down, and that tightness is called cervical spinal canal stenosis. So stenosis means a focal narrowing, and there is focal narrowing of the spinal canal at C5-6, at C6-7, and then again at the mid-thoracic spine level, T7-8.
And that would cause weakness, tingling.
Yes, sir, that's true.
Judge, since he brought up a new subject, and I just crossed on that. Dr. Foley, as I mentioned before, because you did not have any x-rays to compare, you cannot say as an expert to any reasonable degree of medical certainty that on January 13, 2014, that Mr. Reeves suffered from that condition to the extent that you saw in the x-ray that was taken in June of 2015. You have no idea what his condition was in 2014.
I understand what you're saying, and I will agree with you to the degree that without having a film done on that exact day, you can't say what it looked like that exact day, but I can say within a reasonable degree of medical probability that more likely than not, those findings pre-existed the date of the incident. So I would say the person did more likely than not have cervical spinal canal stenosis from the disc abnormalities that are present. But again, partly agreeing with you, because you don't have an exact film on the exact day, I can't say exactly what it looked like on that day.
So to any reasonable degree of medical certainty, you can't quantify to what extent that condition exists.
Well, yes and no on that, because I testified that it takes many, many years to get the kind of finding that we're seeing here. So if the time separation was about a year and a half, something like that, between the date of incident and the date of the films, and my testimony is it takes many, many years to get these kind of findings, so I would say more likely than not, the patient had similar findings to what we're seeing a year and a half later after the incident, and those findings existed prior to the date of incident.
And as we discussed before, every individual's pain threshold is different.
I agree with that.
And so an individual who, and I'm just going to use A and B because let's not make it too complicated. If you have a condition A and it gets worse to B, one person could have pain at A, but really another person could have no pain until they get to condition B, correct?
It's a possibility.
All right. And because you conducted no medical history of Mr. Reeves, and you have no comparison X-ray of Mr. Reeves on January 13, 2014. You cannot tell us in any reasonable degree of medical certainty as to exactly how that impacted Mr. Reeves' daily activity and living on January 13, 2014. Correct?
As I said before, I've agreed with you on that point because my job as a radiologist is to say what I see on the films. I did not do any discussion for the court on what kind of symptoms this particular patient had at a specific date and time.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you, sir.
But one thing you can be certain of is we're looking at an individual that's aging.
Yes, sir. That's true.
Probably a good time for a break. Let's take 10 minutes, ladies and gentlemen, and remember my instructions during the recess, please. And we'll see you back in a few.
All last words in recess.